I remember that day clearly, even though at the time I had no idea it would stay with me forever. It was an ordinary summer day, nothing special on the surface. The sun was already high, the asphalt was warming up, and the air felt heavy and still. Back then, I thought the day would pass like any other, slow and forgettable. The courtyard was unusually quiet, too quiet for summer. Normally there were voices, laughter, doors opening and closing. That day, there was almost nothing, only distant footsteps and the faint sound of dishes from an open window somewhere above. I sat on the bench, swinging my legs, unsure of what to do next. That bench had always been there, old, worn, with peeling paint, warm under the sun. Adults sat there to talk about their lives, and children waited there for someone to come outside. That day, I was sitting on it alone, and for the first time, that loneliness felt noticeable, almost uncomfortable. I remember looking around, expecting someone to appear any second. A friend, a neighbor, anyone. But the yard stayed empty. Trees barely moved, and the shadows seemed frozen in place. Time felt slower, stretched thin. I didn't know why, but something inside me felt restless, like I was waiting for something important to happen. The heat made everything feel slower. Even my thoughts moved carefully, as if they didn't want to disturb the quiet. I remember tracing cracks in the pavement with my eyes, following them like secret paths. At that age, boredom felt endless, but that day it carried a strange weight, like something hidden inside it. At some point, I noticed the light in the windows changing. Curtains moved slightly, shadows shifted. Life was happening somewhere else, behind glass and walls. I felt separated from it, sitting there alone. It was the first time I realized that the world doesn't pause just because you're waiting. I stood up and walked slowly across the yard, kicking a small stone ahead of me. Each step echoed louder than it should have. I remember thinking how big the courtyard felt without people. Spaces grow larger when they're empty, and that emptiness made me feel smaller than usual. There was a moment when I considered going back home. The door was close, familiar, safe, but I stayed. Something told me not to rush, not to escape the silence. I sat back down on the bench and looked at the sky, watching thin clouds drift without any hurry. I didn't know it then, but that waiting mattered, not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. That stillness settled deep inside me. Years later, I would remember this day, not for events, but for the feeling of time slowing down and quietly changing me. The sun began to sink lower, and the light softened. The harsh brightness of the day slowly turned warm and gentle. Shadows grew longer, stretching across the yard like quiet reminders that time was moving, even if I felt stuck in one place. I remember hearing a distant voice calling someone's name, not mine. It echoed briefly and then disappeared. For a second, I felt invisible, like I didn't belong to any call or direction. That feeling stayed with me longer than the sound itself. A small breeze passed through the courtyard, finally breaking the heat. Leaves whispered softly, and I closed my eyes for a moment. I tried to imagine the future, but it felt blurry and far away. Back then, the present moment felt endless, like it would never turn into a memory. When I opened my eyes, the sky had changed again. Pale blue was slowly giving way to soft orange and gray. I realized I had been sitting there for hours. No one came. No one noticed. And somehow, that quiet acceptance felt heavier than disappointment. That was the moment I understood something without words. Waiting doesn't always lead to something. Sometimes, waiting is the thing itself. I stood up, brushed dust from my hands, and knew, even then, that I wouldn't forget this feeling. As evening settled in, the first lights appeared in the windows around the yard. One by one, they turned on, warm and steady. I watched them carefully, feeling a strange comfort. It was reassuring to know that behind those walls, people were eating dinner, talking, living their lives. I stayed a little longer, even though the air was cooling. The bench no longer felt warm, but I didn't move. I wanted to hold on to that moment. Though Primera did NAT understand why. It felt important, like something quiet was being written inside me without my permission. Eventually, I walked toward home. Each step felt heavier than the last. I glanced back at the yard. Already darker, already different. I had the sudden thought that something had ended, even if I couldn't explain what it was. Inside the apartment, everything felt normal. Familiar sounds, familiar smells. Someone asked how my day was. I said it was fine. I didn't know how to explain that nothing happened, and yet something had changed forever. That night, I lay in bed, listening to distant city noises. The image of the empty courtyard stayed with me. I didn't feel sad, just quietly thoughtful. It was the first time I sensed that moments could pass without noise and still leave a mark. Years later, I still return to that day in my thoughts. Not because it was special, but because it was honest. It taught me that growing up doesn't always arrive with events. Sometimes it comes softly, on a quiet evening, when no one is watching. Sometimes I wonder why that memory stayed when so many louder days faded away. Maybe it was because nothing tried to impress me. The day didn't ask for attention. It simply existed, calm and unremarkable, and allowed me to notice myself for the first time. As a child, I didn't have words for feelings like stillness or reflection. I only knew that something inside me had shifted slightly, like a door opening just enough to let a draft in. I felt older, not in years, but in awareness. That courtyard no longer exists the way it did back then. Buildings were repainted, benches replaced, trees cut down, but in my memory, it remains untouched, empty, warm, silent. A place where time paused just long enough to leave a trace. I've had many busy days since then. Days full of conversations, decisions, and noise. Yet none of them feel as clear as that quiet afternoon. It taught me that meaning doesn't always come from action, but from attention. Even now, when life feels overwhelming, I sometimes picture that bench and that fading light. I remember how it felt to sit still without expectations, and for a moment, the world slows down again, just like it did on that unforgettable day. That day didn't explain anything to me. It didn't give answers or direction. It simply showed me that silence can be full, and emptiness can hold weight. A lesson I didn't understand then, but one I carry with me now. Growing up, I learned to fill every moment with sound and movement, but deep down, I know that my sense of calm was born there, in that quiet yard, in a space where nothing happened, and everything quietly began. Some memories shout to be remembered. This one whispers, and maybe that's why it never left. It waits patiently, like it did back then, reminding me that whom I became started forming long before I noticed. If I could return to that day, I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't call someone or leave early. I would sit there again, feeling time stretch and soften, knowing now how rare those moments truly are. That was the day I learned something simple and lasting. Childhood doesn't end with a clear goodbye. Sometimes it fades quietly, on an ordinary evening, in an empty courtyard, leaving behind a feeling you spend your whole life trying to understand. As I grew older, I learned to move faster, to fill silence with plans and noise. Yet something in me always resisted that speed. It remembered how it felt to sit still, to exist without purpose, and to be enough without doing anything at all. As I grew older, I learned to move faster, to fill silence with plans and noise. Yet something in me always resisted that speed. It remembered how it felt to sit still, to exist without purpose, and to be enough without doing anything at all. I realized that day had quietly shaped how I see the world. It taught me to notice what others pass by, to listen not only to voices, but to absence, to understand that meaning often hides in places where nothing seems to happen. People often ask when childhood ends. I never know how to answer. For me, it didn't end with a celebration or a goodbye. It slipped away gently, like the daylight that evening, unnoticed until it was already gone. That empty courtyard became a reference point in my life. Whenever things felt overwhelming, I compared them to that stillness, and somehow, they always felt smaller afterward, easier to hold, easier to let go. I don't remember what I wanted back then. I only remember how it felt to wait without knowing why. That feeling stayed with me, teaching patience in ways no words ever could. Sometimes I think that growing up is learning to recognize those quiet moments again, to stop running, to sit with yourself, even when it feels uncomfortable, and trust that silence isn't empty. That they didn't give me direction, but it gave me awareness. And maybe that's more important. Awareness stays. It follows you through years, choices, and changes, gently reminding you who you were before everything became complicated. I never returned to that exact place, but it lives on inside me. Not as a location, but as a feeling, a soft pause in time that I can visit whenever the world becomes too loud. And maybe that's why the memory still matters. Because in a life full of movement, that quiet day taught me the value of stopping, of noticing, of simply being there on a bench as the light slowly fades